let's review again the three domains of life. Two of these domains, bacteria and archaea, that you see on the bottom of this slide, those are both prokaryotic cells. We've now moved into talking about the eukaryotic organisms, and this would be domain eukarya. We've talked about the protist, which is a very diverse group. We've talked about the plant groups and the fungi, and now we're going to focus in on the animals. Notice that the animals are right down here in the middle of the fungi, and then also some different groups of protist. So as we move through and talk about the animals, we want to keep in mind that they are going to be made up of eukaryotic cells, and they are closely related to fungi and protist groups. Now this chapter is all about animal diversity. We're just really setting the stage for the next two chapters, where we'll talk about the invertebrates and then also vertebrate groups and phylum. And here we just want to get an idea of the timing of evolution, and then also some of the major developments that gave rise to the body plans that we see in animals today. So if we talk first about what are the general characteristics of an animal, what makes something an animal? Well, it's hard to really narrow it down specifically, but we can talk about some major things that most of them do have in common. So one of those, to get us started, is that they are heterotrophic. Heterotrophic means that these are not able to synthesize their own food. So they're going to rely on other organisms to produce organic molecules that they can then consume. Now this may mean that they are predators, it may mean that they are scavengers, but in any case, they're not going to be able to perform any photosynthesis like a lot of the protists and the plants did. Another thing that is pretty common with animals is that these are going to be multicellular. They are going to have bodies that are made up of many cells. These are eukaryotic cells. And these are also, in many cases, going to be specialized cells. So there will be groups of specialized cells to give us things like nerve tissue, muscle tissue. And so this is something that we didn't have in other organisms. In plants, we did have some different tissues there, like the vascular tissue, but we certainly didn't have nerve and muscle tissues. Another thing is that they're going to be characterized by sexual reproduction. We will see that there are some cases where there is some asexual reproduction taking place, but by and large, most of the animals are going to be reproducing sexually. That process of sexual reproduction is going to enable them to have a lot of diversity in animal populations. And we know that that diversity or genetic variation is extremely important for natural selection to act upon. So with this, we're typically going to have a flagellated sperm. And that flagellated sperm is going to fertilize a non-motile, non-moving egg. So that's the typical scenario. We will have male and female organisms. In some cases, we will have hermaphrodite organisms where they have both the male and female sexual organs as well. But it's a flagellated, a moving sperm that's going to swim to a non-motile egg. And then the last thing we want to mention here is that we have a zygote, which is going to undergo a series of mitotic divisions, so mitosis, and this is going to produce the embryo, which will then later divide. Now, if we look at this embryo that's going to be produced, we're going to start with a zygote, and that zygote is the fertilized egg. So as soon as that sperm swims to the egg and fertilizes it, that's what we call the zygote. So this is going to be a diploid individual. So by diploid, we're talking about 2 copies of all of the chromosomes. Half of them, or 1 copy, came from the sperm and 1 copy came from the egg. That zygote is then going to undergo a series of cell divisions, and we call these cleavage, and cleavage is mitosis. So if you'll recall from your Bio 1 days, mitosis is going to be cell division that produces identical cells. So every time this zygote undergoes cell division, that one cell will divide to produce 2 new cells. So By the time we get to this 8-cell stage down here, that was actually 3 mitosis rounds that took place, because we're going to take that 1 cell, it's going to divide so that we get 2 cells, then each of those 2 cells is going to, so that would be the first division. Then when we divide the second time, those 2 cells are going to each split to give us 4, and then when we divide the third time, the 4 all split to give us the 8. So when we get to this stage, we've had 3 divisions take place. That 8-cell stage is the beginnings of the embryo. With more rounds of mitosis or cleavage, we get this structure which is called the blastula. This blastula is characteristic for being hollow. So it is a hollow ball, and you can see that when it's cut in cross section, like you see on this slide. And the inside of that is what we typically call the blastocele. Now, through the process of gastrulation, and this is something that is unique to animals, that blastula is going to have some folding that takes place. So gastrulation is going to be a process that's characteristic of animal development. So through this process, the blastula is going to fold in. When it folds in this manner, we're going to start to get some layers. So we get some layering take place, and we have different names for these layers. What's shown here in blue is what we would call the ectoderm, or the outer layer. That's going to develop into the body wall, or the outer layer of the organism. And then the yellow is shown here as the endoderm. The endoderm is going to form the insides or the beginnings of the digestive tract of the organism. We can also identify the blastopore. This is the little opening that's at the bottom from where that initial infolding took place. Another thing that's fairly characteristic is that many of them have a larva stage. So this picture at the top is an example of a larva stage. In particular, this is showing an insect or a mosquito. The larva stage is a sexually immature stage. So it's immature. It is going to be morphologically different from the adult. And not only is it morphologically different, but they usually have different habitats, food sources. A mosquito larva would reside in water, so in an aqueous environment, and then the adults live in dry land. So the larva is immature. That larva, through a period of development known as metamorphosis, is going to develop into the adult form. And that adult is going to then take a period of time to develop into a sexually mature adult. We don't see this larva or metamorphosis take place with organisms that are not animals. So this is characteristic of them. On the bottom of the slide, we have an example of a tadpole. That is an immature stage for amphibians. We'll talk about that more when we get to the vertebrate chapter, but just know that animals have these different stages that they can go through. This doesn't mean that it happens with all animals. As we know that humans, they don't have a larval stage, they don't go through this metamorphosis, we just have a period of time when we go from a juvenile to a sexually mature adult. Now, all of these developmental stages, they are controlled by specific genes. And when we're talking about animals, these are what we call Hox genes. Hox genes have specific structures to them, or DNA sequences within them, which we call homeobox sections. And these are very important for controlling animal development. Alterations in these Hox genes can cause big changes in the body plans of animals. And they've been very important over evolutionary time and have led to a lot of the great diversity that we see in animals today. If we take a look here at this specific tree of life and just locate the animals on here, the metazoans would be the animals. And these animals, notice how closely related they are to this specific group of protists. So the choanoflagellates, they are protists, and the animals are believed to have shared a common ancestor with that specific protist group. So that protist group is the closest living relatives of animals. If we talk about the evolutionary history of animals, we first begin to see fossils of these in this specific era. And this was about 565 to 550 million years ago. These fossils, as they appear, they are soft-bodied, and they're also going to be multicellular. And we can see some examples of that in this specific picture here. Notice they are very simple organisms, and they're not what we would typically think of when we think of animals. They look very different from the animals that we have today. The name that we give these is the Ediacaran biota, and this has to do with where they were discovered. But if we look at some examples of fossils, here's two examples. Notice that these are very simple organisms, and they are going to be primarily radial in their symmetry. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by radial symmetry in just a few moments. If we move on to the Paleozoic era, this is when we started to really have some rapid development of animal phyla. These animals initially looked very different, again, from what we know of today as animals, but there are a lot of fossils that document this. These animals had particularly hard mineralized skeletons, and so that helped them to really develop into fossils or be preserved as fossils. And about half of the phyla of animals evolved during this time period. This is when we had the Cambrian Explosion. So during the Cambrian Explosion, there was a very rapid diversification of animal groups. This also corresponded with rapid diversification of other groups, such as the plants. Now, one reason that we had a lot of rapid diversification is thought to be because there was some changes in the atmosphere of the Earth's surface, and this would have had something to do with the plants beginning to really photosynthesize a lot. And we also had the evolution of a lot of different groups of animals that some of them were predators, so some adaptations would have helped them to catch prey, others would have helped organisms to get away from the predators. And just keep in mind that anytime we're talking about natural selection, it's an interaction between an organism's genotype and the environment. And that environment includes the other organisms that are present in the environment. So if you have a lot of changes in one group of animals or organisms, that is going to be reflected in changes that occur in other groups of organisms. At the same time that we had this rapid explosion of animal groups or animal phyla, we also had some that went away. So we also had the extinction of a number of groups of phyla as well. Now, if we just look at some of the more recent periods of evolution, during the Mesozoic era is when we had the lots of vertebrates, so lots of dinosaurs is what that's best known for, and then also your angiosperms, which we've talked about already in earlier chapters. And then in the Cenozoic era, this is when we start to really see animals move a lot to land, and eventually we finish up with the evolution of humans.